An arrogant passenger mocked an older man until he realized it was Clint Eastwood. You won't believe how it ended. The hum of activity surrounded the boarding gate for the early morning flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. Passengers shuffled forward in neat lines, clutching coffee cups and carry-ons, their faces set with a mix of fatigue and purpose. It was a first-class boarding group, and the energy felt both exclusive and restrained. Among them was a man who stood out, not just for his tailored navy suit or the polished leather shoes that gleamed under the terminal's fluorescent lights, but for the way he carried himself, with an air of superiority that seemed to command attention. This man, in his mid-40s, had the look of someone who'd spent his life climbing corporate ladders, collecting accolades, and never doubting his place at the top. He wasn't here to simply fly. He was here to assert his dominance even among strangers. As he strolled toward the gate, his leather briefcase swinging in perfect rhythm with his steps, he glanced at the passengers around him with thinly veiled disinterest. Soon he was comfortably settled in his first-class seat, scrolling through emails on his tablet as other passengers filed in. That's when he noticed him, the older man who shuffled down the aisle carrying nothing but a small bag. The man wasn't dressed for first class, at least not by the businessman's standards. A tan jacket, a plaid shirt, and a pair of worn loafers completed his look. His face, though weathered by time, held a certain calmness, like someone who had seen enough of life to be unaffected by trivialities. The older man moved quietly, settling into his seat with little fuss. He adjusted his jacket, placed his bag under the seat in front of him, and leaned back, gazing out the window. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, a picture of modesty and simplicity. But to the businessman, he was an anomaly. The younger man glanced at him, then at the flight attendant who was helping a few passengers find their seats. With a sly grin, he leaned over just enough to ensure the older man could hear him. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he said with a smirk. A few heads turned, subtle reactions from nearby passengers. The older man, however, didn't flinch. He glanced at the businessman briefly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips, before turning back to the window. The lack of reaction seemed to irritate the businessman. Undeterred, he added, "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" His tone was sharper this time, laced with condescension. Still, the older man didn't take the bait. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and kept his gaze fixed on the tarmac. His silence was louder than any response he could have given, and it only fueled the businessman's arrogance. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, and the businessman finally leaned back, satisfied with his attempted humor. But as the plane began to taxi, something about the older man's calm demeanor began to gnaw at him. It wasn't just the silence, it was the quiet confidence.
The unshakable sense of self that felt almost out of place in a world where appearances seemed to mean everything. But the businessman wasn't ready to let it go. For him, the flight was just beginning, and little did he know, so was a lesson he'd never forget. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a familiar rhythm. The occasional ding of a call button, the rustling of newspapers, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air. But the businessman, seated just a row away from the older man, couldn't let the interaction slide. Something about the older man's presence, his calmness, his refusal to engage, felt like a challenge, though he couldn't quite articulate why. He crossed one leg over the other and leaned slightly into the aisle, glancing at the man who continued to stare out the window. The businessman's lips curled into a smirk as he decided to press on. "I'm curious," he said, loud enough for a few passengers nearby to hear. "What brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win, or are you here to reminisce about the good old days when planes were still powered by propellers?" A few passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but no one stepped in. The older man didn't react immediately, taking a slow, measured breath before turning slightly toward the businessman. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The older man's gaze was steady and bothered, almost as though he was sizing up the younger man's intentions. Then, without saying a word, he turned back to the window, his expression as composed as ever. The lack of reaction only emboldened the businessman. He leaned back in his seat, speaking louder now, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not much for conversation, huh? I guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones." He chuckled to himself, his tone making it clear that he thought he'd won whatever imaginary battle he'd conjured up. The older man again remained silent. He folded his hands neatly in his lap and adjusted the cuff of his tan jacket, a subtle movement that seemed to say, "You're not worth my time." Nearby passengers began to shift in their seats. A woman in her 50s glanced at the businessman with a look of disapproval, while a young couple sitting across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes darting toward the older man. The tension in the cabin grew thicker, but no one stepped in to stop the scene from escalating. The businessman, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, turned to a man sitting across the aisle, a fellow professional in a pressed suit. "You know," he began, gesturing toward the older man. "People like to complain about progress, but I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time. No cell phones, no tech, no real innovation. How did they even survive back then?" The man across the aisle gave an uncomfortable laugh, clearly not wanting to get involved. But the businessman didn't notice or didn't care. He continued, "They always talk about how things were better, but it's just nostalgia. The world's moved on. It's better now, no matter what they say." The flight attendant approached, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle, her professional smile slightly strained. She reached the older man's row and leaned down. "Mr. Eastwood," she said in a warm, respectful tone, "would you like coffee or tea?" The moment the words left her mouth, the businessman froze. His tablet slipped from his hands onto his lap as the name struck him like a bolt of lightning. Eastwood. His mind raced, disbelief washing over him. Could it be? The older man turned toward the flight attendant and offered her a polite smile. "Coffee. Black, please," he said in a calm, steady voice. The businessman's jaw tightened as he processed the name, the voice, and the face now taking shape in his memory. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director whose reputation preceded him in every room, in every space. And here he was, sitting just a row away, quietly enduring the businessman's condescension. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the cabin as passengers caught on to the revelation. "Is that really him?" one woman murmured to her husband. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another passenger whispered excitedly. The businessman's face turned pale as the truth sank in. The man he'd been mocking wasn't just any older passenger. He was a Hollywood iconic figure synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom. The weight of his mistake hit him all at once, leaving him speechless. But the realization wasn't the end of his humiliation. It was only the beginning of a lesson that would unfold in front of the entire cabin. The businessman sat frozen in his seat, the weight of recognition pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Clint Eastwood. The name echoed in his mind as he struggled to connect the dots between the iconic figure he'd grown up hearing about and the quiet man in a tan jacket who had absorbed his jabs without a single word of protest. He stole another glance at Eastwood, who was now calmly sipping his coffee, seemingly indifferent or, perhaps simply unbothered by, the ripple of whispers spreading through the cabin. Passengers leaned toward one another, their murmurs growing louder as the realization dawned on more and more of them. "That's Clint Eastwood, isn't it?" A woman a few rows back said excitedly to her husband. "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is," he replied, craning his neck for a better view. The businessman's ears burned as the words reached him. He slumped slightly in his seat, wishing he could somehow disappear into the cushions. The quiet conversations around him only magnified his embarrassment, each one like a tiny spotlight exposing his foolishness. He clenched his hands around the armrests, his mind racing. How did I not recognize him? How could I have been so blind? But it wasn't just that he hadn't recognized Eastwood, it was the way he'd spoken to him, dismissive, condescending, mocking. He'd treated him like an irrelevant relic of the past. And now the realization of just how wrong he'd been felt like a punch to the gut. Finally, he mustered the courage to speak. Leaning slightly forward in his seat, he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood." His voice was quiet now, hesitant, a far cry from the loud, arrogant tone he'd used earlier. Eastwood turned his head slowly, his piercing eyes locked onto the businessman's. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it wasn't welcoming either. It was the kind of gaze that made people freeze, a look filled with quiet authority and the wisdom of someone who had seen and endured far more than most could fathom. "Yes," Eastwood said simply, his voice steady and composed. The businessman opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. What could he possibly say? "Sorry for being an ass. Sorry, I didn't recognize you. Sorry for treating you like you didn't belong here." None of it felt adequate. I didn't realize," he stammered, his words trailing off awkwardly. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. Waiting, his silence only deepened the businessman's discomfort. "I didn't mean to offend you," the businessman finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Well, I didn't realize who you were." For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Eastwood's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table in front of him and leaned back slightly in his seat. "And if I wasn't who you think I am?" he asked, his tone measured, but pointed. The businessman blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Eastwood tilted his head, his gaze unyielding. "If I were just some ordinary guy in a plaid shirt, would that make the way you spoke to me acceptable?" The businessman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question struck harder than he anticipated, and for a moment, all he could do was sit there, staring at the man he had so arrogantly dismissed. The murmurs in the cabin grew softer as passengers tuned into the exchange. Even the flight attendants, busy moving through the aisles, slowed their steps, their eyes darting toward Eastwood and the businessman. The businessman swallowed hard, his face flushed with embarrassment. I guess not, he admitted at last, his voice barely audible. Eastwood gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as though that was the response he'd anticipated all along. Then, without another word, he picked up his coffee and turned back toward the window, signaling that, for him, the conversation had ended. But for the businessman, the moment was far from over. The lesson Eastwood had just delivered calmly, succinctly, and with more impact than any raised voice or angry retort ever could hung heavily in the air. There was no escaping it. The businessman sat stiffly in his seat, his mind still reeling. Eastwood's words were like a mirror, reflecting his arrogance and assumptions back at him. He wanted to apologize again, to find the right words to make amends. But his confidence, the very trait he had flaunted earlier, was nowhere to be found. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward again, his voice low and tentative. Mr. Eastwood, I owe you an apology. I wasn't trying to. Eastwood raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence, but his expression remained calm. You don't need to explain, he said, his tone even but firm. What's done is done. But there's a lesson here, if you're willing to hear it. The businessman nodded quickly, his eyes wide, eager to redeem himself. The cabin seemed to hush, as if even the other passengers were waiting to hear what Clint Eastwood would say next. Eastwood leaned back slightly, his fingers loosely wrapped around his coffee cup. People always think respect is something you earn by being someone important, someone with a title or a reputation, he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of wisdom. But real respect, that's not about who the other person is. It's about who you are. The businessman's breath hitched. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Eastwood's words struck him deeply, the simplicity of the truth cutting through all the justifications he had been rehearsing. You see, Eastwood continued, his gaze unwavering, respect isn't conditional. It's not something you dole out based on how someone looks, what they're wearing, or whether or not you recognize their name. It's about how you conduct yourself, how you treat others, even when you think no one's paying attention. The businessman felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. He had built his life on achievement and status, priding himself on being a self-made man. Yet here he was, being taught the most fundamental principle of decency by someone he had so carelessly underestimated. Eastwood took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it gently back down on the tray table. I've been around long enough to know that people like to make snap judgments. They think they've got someone all figured out the moment they lay eyes on them. But those assumptions, he gave a slight shake of his head, say more about the person making them than the person they're about. The businessman swallowed hard, his throat suddenly parched. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of his own guilt rendered him mute. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Eastwood said, his tone softening just a bit. I'm telling you because I hope you'll think about it the next time you look at someone and decide they're worth less than you. For a moment, the cabin was utterly still. The businessman sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Eastwood, who had now turned back toward the window, his demeanor as composed as ever. The businessman's thoughts spiraled. He recalled all the times he had dismissed people in his life, coworkers, strangers, even friends, because they didn't fit into his narrow definition of success or significance. How many opportunities had he overlooked to connect, to empathize, because of his own arrogance? But as he sat there, wrestling with the gravity of his behavior, he realized that Eastwood's words weren't just a reprimand. They were an invitation, a chance to change. As the flight continued, the businessman remained silent, his mind churning with a mix of regret and self-reflection. The hum of conversation around him became a distant murmur, a faint backdrop to the storm raging inside. Clint Eastwood's words echoed in his mind, each sentence landing harder with every replay. Respect isn't about who the other person is, it's about who you are. He glanced again at Eastwood, who sat serenely in his seat, gazing out the window as though the entire exchange had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in a long and eventful life. There was no hostility in his expression, no lingering annoyance. It was as if the lesson had been imparted, and the older man had moved on, leaving the businessman alone with his thoughts. And those thoughts were unrelenting. The businessman began to replay not just this interaction, but other moments from his past where he'd been quick to judge, quick to dismiss. He thought about the intern he had once mocked for suggesting an idea he deemed too naive to understand. Months later, that very idea became a cornerstone of the company's success, though it was credited to someone else. He thought about the janitor at his office whom he had never bothered to greet until the day that man stopped to help him pick up scattered papers after he'd tripped in the hallway. He thought about colleagues whose opinions he had brushed aside, neighbors whose names he had never learned, strangers whose stories he had never cared to hear. Each memory added to the weight in his chest, growing awareness of how his arrogance and assumptions had shaped his interactions with others. He had built a life on the belief that success and intelligence gave him the right to look down on people, to measure their worth by his own flawed standards. But Eastwood's calm words had shattered that illusion. The businessman shifted uneasily in his seat. He wasn't accustomed to feeling small. He prided himself on being in control, on knowing how to command a room. Yet here he was, humbled by a man who hadn't raised his voice, hadn't argued, hadn't done anything but speak the truth. A memory from his childhood surfaced unexpectedly. He remembered his father, a strict but fair man, telling him, "Son, how you treat someone who can't do anything for you says more about your character than anything else." At the time, he had dismissed the words, too young and self-assured to think they applied to him. Now, sitting in first class with the weight of his own behavior pressing down on him, those words felt more relevant than ever. He glanced around the cabin, noticing the quiet admiration others seemed to have for Eastwood. Passengers who had barely looked up from their devices earlier were now sneaking glances, whispering among themselves. But Eastwood didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. His quiet confidence wasn't performative. It wasn't about commanding attention or seeking validation. It was simply who he was. The businessman felt a pang of envy, not for Eastwood's fame or success, but for his sense of self. He realized that his own confidence had always been tied to external markers: his job title, his salary, his possessions. Without those things, who was he? Could he still command respect, or would he crumble under the weight of his own insecurities? He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of how tightly he was gripping the armrests. His knuckles were white, his palms damp. Slowly, he released his grip and took a deep breath. There was no undoing what he had said to Eastwood, no erasing the humiliation of this flight. But there was one thing he could do. He could learn. For the remainder of the flight, the businessman stayed silent, his mind consumed by the implications of Eastwood's words. He thought about the kind of person he wanted to become, the kind of person who could command respect, not through power or wealth, but through kindness and humility. He didn't know if it was too late to change, but he knew he had to try. As the plane descended, one thing became clear: this wasn't just another flight. It was a turning point, a moment that would stay with him long after the wheels touched the ground. The landing gear deployed, and cabin lights brightened as flight attendants checked seatbelts. For everyone else, it was routine. But for the businessman, this flight was anything but ordinary. He glanced at the Los Angeles skyline. Normally, it brought excitement for deals and meetings. Today, it reminded him of the man he'd been, a man blinded by status. The plane landed smoothly. Eastwood's words still echoed. Respect isn't about who the other person is. It's about who you are. The businessman moved slowly, fumbling with his briefcase. Then, Eastwood rose, calm and deliberate. Pausing, he gave a small, forgiving smile. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice steady. Eastwood exited, leaving the businessman stunned. Those words weren't just a farewell, they were an invitation to change. After the quiet reflection of the flight, the lesson stayed with him. He thought about the times he'd judged people by appearance or status, the opportunities he'd missed to connect because of his ego. He resolved to be someone who gave respect freely, not for gain, but because it was right. At baggage claim, he paused, pulling out his phone. Instead of diving into work, he opened a blank note and typed 3 words: "Be like Eastwood." He didn't know what the future held, but he couldn't go back to who he was. The flight had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully grasp. Sometimes, the most important lessons don't come from lectures, but quiet moments that force you to see yourself. Stepping into the Los Angeles sun, he felt humility, something long absent. And with humility came hope, the hope to start again, with a more open heart and mind. If this story inspired you, share it, and let us know. What would you have done in his shoes?